You know, I've lived in a lot of places over the years, but nothing quite prepared me for Meadowbrook Heights. It's one of those picture-perfect suburban developments where every lawn is exactly 2 3/4 inches tall. Every mailbox is regulation beige, and every resident has signed away their soul to the almighty HOA. And at the helm of this particular ship of suburban tyranny, meet Karen Pemberton, our self-appointed neighborhood dictator. Karen wasn't just any HOA president. Oh no, she was the type who measured your grass with an actual ruler, who knew the exact shade of approved exterior paint colors by heart, and who had the local police department on speed dial. She'd moved into Meadowbrook Heights 3 years ago after her divorce, and apparently decided that controlling every aspect of 247 families' lives was the perfect way to fill the void in her own. The woman was a walking HOA violation detector. She'd cruise the neighborhood in her pristine white SUV every morning at exactly 7 a.m., clipboard in hand, looking for infractions like a hawk hunting field mice. Too many decorative rocks in your garden bed? That's a $50 fine. Forgot to move your trash cans back from the curb by 6 p.m.? Another 50. Left your porch light on past 10 p.m.? You guessed it, $50 more. Now, I'd managed to fly under Karen's radar for the most part. My house was a modest 2-story colonial at the end of Maple Street, and I kept to myself. I worked from home as a land surveyor and property consultant, which meant I spent most of my time buried in legal documents and property maps. Little did I know that this particular skill set would come in handy sooner than I expected. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was enjoying my coffee on the back porch when I heard shouting from the street. Not the good kind of shouting, mind you, but the shrill, entitled kind that makes your teeth ache. I wandered around to my front yard to investigate, and there she was, Karen Pemberton in all her glory, standing on the sidewalk with her hands on her hips, yelling at a 10-year-old boy. The kid was Tommy Martinez, and he lived 2 houses down from me with his single mom, Rosa. Sweet kid, polite, always said hello when he saw me. He was standing there looking absolutely terrified while Karen towered over him, her face turning that particular shade of red that matched her lipstick. What exactly do you think you're doing, young man? This is private property. You cannot ride your bicycle here. I'm going to call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Poor Tommy looked like he was about to cry. His little bike was lying on its side next to him, and he kept looking around desperately, probably hoping his mom would appear and save him from this suburban nightmare. But Rosa worked double shifts at the hospital, and she wasn't due home for hours. I couldn't just stand there and watch this unfold. I mean, come on, the kid was 10 years old, and he was riding his bike on a public sidewalk. There's overzealous HOA enforcement, and then there's just plain bullying. So I walked over. Excuse me, Karen, is there a problem here? She whirled around to face me, and I swear I could see the steam coming out of her ears. Oh, perfect. Another one of you people who thinks the rules don't apply to them. This child is trespassing on HOA property, and I'm handling it according to our covenants. I looked down at Tommy, who was still standing exactly where he'd been when I first saw him, which was on the public sidewalk. Then I looked back at Karen. I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion here. Tommy's standing on the sidewalk, which is public property. He's not trespassing on anything. Karen's eyes narrowed to little slits. The sidewalk is maintained by the HOA. It's clearly outlined in our property boundaries. This is private property, and this child does not belong here. Now, here's where my professional background came in handy. You see, I'd actually done some research on our neighborhood's property lines when I first moved in. It's a habit of mine, occupational hazard. And I knew for a fact that the sidewalks in Meadowbrook Heights were public easements, maintained by the city, not the HOA. But I also knew that arguing with Karen in front of a scared 10-year-old wasn't going to accomplish anything. Why don't we let Tommy go home, and then we can discuss this like adults? But Karen was having none of it. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. I'm calling 911. This is trespassing, and I want this child arrested. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was actually calling the police on a 10-year-old for riding his bike on a public sidewalk. This was beyond petty power tripping. This was just cruel. Tommy, why don't you head home? Your mom will be worried if you're late. The kid didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his bike and pedaled away as fast as his little legs could carry him. Karen, meanwhile, was already talking to the dispatcher, giving them a dramatic account of how she'd caught a juvenile trespasser on HOA property. 20 minutes later, Officer Johnson arrived. He was a middle-aged guy with the patient demeanor of someone who'd dealt with HOA complaints before. Karen immediately launched into her story, complete with hand gestures and references to maintaining property values and protecting our community. Officer Johnson listened politely, then asked to see the property boundaries she was referring to. Karen confidently marched over to the sidewalk and pointed down. Right here. This entire sidewalk is HOA property. We maintain it, we own it, and that child was trespassing. The officer looked at me. Sir, do you have any knowledge of the property boundaries here? I nodded. Actually, I do. I'm a land surveyor, and I've reviewed the plat maps for this development. The sidewalks are public easements, maintained by the city. They're not HOA property. Karen's face went from red to purple. That's absolutely ridiculous. I'm the HOA president. I know what property we own. Officer Johnson was already pulling out his radio. Dispatch, can you have someone check the property records for Meadowbrook Heights? I need to verify the ownership of the sidewalks. It took about 10 minutes for the confirmation to come back. The sidewalks were indeed public property, maintained by the city under a public easement. Officer Johnson delivered this news to Karen with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed his annoyance at having his time wasted. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to be more careful about what constitutes trespassing in the future. This child was on public property and had every right to be there. Karen was not taking this well. This is unacceptable. I'm going to file a complaint about this. Someone needs to clarify these property boundaries immediately. And that's when she made her fatal mistake. She turned to me with a look of pure venom and said, "And you, I'm going to make sure you regret interfering with HOA business. I know where you live, and I'm going to be watching you very closely from now on." Officer Johnson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, that sounds an awful lot like harassment. I'd suggest you stick to legitimate HOA business and leave the law enforcement to us." After the officer left, Karen stood there for a moment, clearly trying to process what had just happened. She wasn't used to being told she was wrong, and she definitely wasn't used to being corrected in front of witnesses. But instead of backing down, she seemed to take it as a personal challenge. "This isn't over," she said, pointing her finger at me. "I'm going to find out exactly what your property boundaries are, and when I do, you're going to wish you'd minded your own business." I just smiled. "Looking forward to it, Karen." Over the next few days, I started noticing Karen's white SUV parked across from my house at various times. She'd sit there with her clipboard, occasionally taking pictures of my property. It was like having my own personal, very annoying surveillance team. Then the violation notices started arriving. First, it was for excessive decorative elements, because I had a small garden gnome on my front porch. Then it was for non-regulation mailbox height, because mine was apparently 3 inches too tall. Next came a notice about my improperly maintained driveway, because there was a tiny oil stain near the garage. Each violation came with a $50 fine and a 30-day deadline to correct the issue. Karen was clearly trying to make my life miserable, and I had to admit, she was doing a pretty good job of it. But here's the thing about being a land surveyor. You learn to be very, very careful about details. And when someone starts throwing around property boundary claims, you tend to want to verify everything. So I decided to do a little research of my own. I pulled out my professional survey equipment and started mapping the exact boundaries of not just my property, but the entire Meadowbrook Heights development. It was tedious work, but I had time on my hands, and frankly, I was curious about what Karen might be getting wrong. What I found was interesting. Very interesting. The HOA's property boundaries were indeed clearly defined in the original development plans. But there was something else in those plans, something that I don't think Karen had bothered to look at closely. There was a utility easement that ran along the back edge of the development, a strip of land about 50 feet wide that provided access for power lines and water mains. Now, easements are tricky things. They're not exactly public property, but they're not exactly private property either. The landowner still technically owns the land, but they've granted specific rights to use it to someone else. In this case, the city had a permanent easement for utilities, which meant they could access that land whenever they needed to for maintenance or improvements. But here's where it got really interesting. The HOA had been treating that easement land as their own private property for years. They'd landscaped it, put up decorative fencing, even installed a small playground. And according to the easement agreement, they had no right to do any of that without the city's permission. I spent the next week double-checking my findings, cross-referencing property records, and making sure I had all my facts straight. And the more I dug, the more problems I found. The HOA hadn't just built on the easement land, they'd actually been charging residents for the maintenance of that area. It was listed in their annual budget as common area maintenance, and every homeowner in the development had been paying for it through their HOA fees. But the real kicker? The city had been trying to access that easement for the past 2 years to install new water mains, and the HOA had been refusing to let them in, claiming it was private property. The city had been patient, trying to work through the bureaucracy, but their patience was wearing thin. I decided it was time to have a conversation with someone at the city planning office. I met with Janet Morrison, the city's head of utilities planning, on a Thursday morning. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who looked like she'd dealt with more than her share of property disputes over the years. I laid out my findings for her, complete with survey maps and property records. Janet listened quietly, occasionally asking questions about specific measurements or boundary markers. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long sigh. We've been wondering about this for months. The HOA keeps telling us we can't access the easement, but we knew something wasn't right. We just didn't have the detailed survey work to prove it. She pulled out a thick file folder and spread some documents across her desk. The thing is, we're not just talking about routine maintenance here. We're talking about a major infrastructure project. The city has been awarded a $5 million federal grant to upgrade the water system in this part of town, and the main pipeline runs right through that easement. $5 million. That got my attention. Janet continued, if we can't access the easement, we'll have to find an alternative route for the pipeline. That means acquiring new property, which means using eminent domain, which means legal costs and delays. The federal grant has a deadline, and if we can't meet it, we lose the funding. I was starting to see the bigger picture. The HOA's illegal use of the easement wasn't just a technical violation. It was potentially costing the city $5 million in federal funding. What would happen if the city decided to enforce the easement agreement? Janet smiled grimly. Well, first, we'd have to remove everything the HOA has built on the easement land. The playground, the fencing, the landscaping, all of it. Then we'd have to restore the land to its original condition so we can install the pipeline. The HOA would be responsible for all the costs, of course. And if they couldn't pay, then we'd have to place liens on the individual properties in the development. Every homeowner would be liable for their share of the costs. I was beginning to understand why Karen had been so adamant about the property boundaries. She probably knew, on some level, that the HOA was on shaky legal ground. But instead of dealing with the problem responsibly, she decided to double down and try to intimidate anyone who questioned her. Big mistake. I asked Janet what she needed to move forward with enforcement of the easement agreement. She said she'd need a detailed survey of the affected area, which I was happy to provide. She also said she'd need to present the findings to the city council, which would then have to vote on whether to pursue legal action. How long do you think that process would take? If we move quickly? Maybe 2 weeks. The council meets next Thursday, and this grant deadline is breathing down our necks. We can't afford to wait much longer. I left the meeting feeling like I'd just lit a very large fuse. In 2 weeks, Karen and the HOA board were going to get a very unpleasant surprise. But Karen wasn't done with me yet. That weekend, I found another violation notice on my door. This one was for unauthorized property modifications, because I'd apparently installed a new doorbell without HOA approval. The doorbell in question was the same one that had been there when I bought the house 3 years ago. This was getting ridiculous. I decided it was time to attend an HOA board meeting. The meeting was held in the community center on Tuesday evening. There were about 20 residents in attendance, which was actually a pretty good turnout for Meadowbrook Heights. Karen sat at the front of the room with the other board members, looking very official with her stack of papers and her gavel. The first part of the meeting was routine stuff, budget reports, maintenance schedules, upcoming events. But then Karen got to her favorite part, violation enforcement. I want to remind everyone that our community standards are what keep our property values high. We've had some recent challenges from residents who seem to think the rules don't apply to them. She was looking right at me when she said this. I want to make it clear that the HOA board will not tolerate harassment or interference with our enforcement procedures. We have the full authority to maintain our community standards, and we will use that authority to protect our residents. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Karen's tone was getting more aggressive by the minute. In fact, I'm proposing that we increase our fines for repeat violations. Anyone who receives more than 3 violations in a calendar year should face escalating penalties, up to and including liens on their property. That got everyone's attention. Several residents started talking at once, and Karen had to bang her gavel to restore order. The board will vote on this proposal at our next meeting. Anyone who has concerns can submit them in writing. I raised my hand. I have a question about property boundaries. Karen's eyes narrowed. What kind of question? Well, I've been doing some research on the development's property lines, and I'm wondering if the board has reviewed the easement agreements that were part of the original development. The room got very quiet. Karen's face started turning that familiar shade of red. The HOA board is fully aware of all property boundaries within our development. We don't need advice from residents who think they know better than elected officials. I'm just curious about the utility easement that runs along the back of the development. Have you had any recent communication with the city about accessing that area? Karen slammed her gavel down. This meeting is about HOA business, not wild speculation about property lines. If you have specific concerns, you can submit them in writing like everyone else. But I could see that I'd hit a nerve. Karen was clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking, and she was trying to shut it down before anyone else started asking questions. I'm just wondering because I know the city has been trying to do some infrastructure work in the area, and I want to make sure we're not interfering with any legitimate municipal projects. One of the other board members, a guy named Steve, leaned forward. What kind of infrastructure work? Karen shot him a look that could have melted steel. Steve, we're not going to discuss speculative municipal projects based on rumors and gossip. But Steve wasn't backing down. If the city is planning work that affects our community, shouldn't we know about it? There is no city project that affects our community. This is just troublemaking from someone who doesn't like being held accountable for HOA violations. I could see that Karen was getting rattled, and I decided to press the advantage. Actually, I think there might be some confusion about which areas are actually HOA property. Have you had the development surveyed recently? We don't need to survey our own property. We know exactly what we own. But what about the playground area? And the decorative fencing along the back edge? Are those definitely on HOA property? Karen stood up so fast her chair fell over. This meeting is adjourned. Anyone who has legitimate HOA business can contact the board in writing. She stormed out of the room, leaving the other board members looking confused and embarrassed. Several residents came up to me afterward, asking about the property boundaries and the city projects I'd mentioned. I gave them general information and suggested they might want to do their own research. Word travels fast in a small community, and by the next morning, I was getting calls from neighbors asking about the easement situation. I explained what I'd found, always careful to stick to the facts and avoid speculation. But the facts were pretty damning on their own. The HOA had been illegally occupying city easement land for years. They'd been charging residents for maintenance of that land, and they'd been preventing the city from accessing it for legitimate infrastructure projects. On Thursday morning, I got a call from Janet Morrison at the city planning office. The city council voted unanimously to enforce the easement agreement. We're sending a formal notice to the HOA today, and we're giving them 30 days to remove all improvements from the easement land. What happens if they don't comply? Then we start legal proceedings. And given the amount of money involved, that's not going to be pleasant for anyone. The formal notice was delivered to Karen's house that afternoon. I know because I happened to be working in my front yard when the city courier arrived. Karen came out to sign for the certified letter, and I could see her hands shaking as she read it. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was Karen, and she was practically screaming. "This is all your fault. You've been spreading lies about our property boundaries, and now you've got the city involved in HOA business." I kept my voice calm and professional. "Karen, I didn't spread any lies. I simply provided accurate survey information to the appropriate city officials. You had no right to interfere with HOA property. Actually, that's the point. It's not HOA property. It's city easement land, and it never belonged to the HOA in the first place." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're going to regret this. I'm going to sue you for harassment and interference with HOA business." "That's certainly your right, Karen. But you might want to talk to a lawyer first about the HOA's legal exposure in this situation." She hung up on me. Over the next few days, I could see increased activity around Karen's house. There were cars coming and going at all hours, and I occasionally spotted people in suits walking around the development with clipboards and measuring tapes. The HOA was clearly trying to figure out how to respond to the city's notice. But their 30 days were almost up, and as far as I could tell, they hadn't made any effort to remove the improvements from the easement land. The playground was still there, the fencing was still up, and the landscaping was still being maintained. On the 28th day, I got another call from Janet Morrison. The HOA has requested a meeting with city officials to discuss the easement situation. They're claiming they've been managing the land with the city's implicit permission. Is that true? Absolutely not. We have no record of any permission being granted for improvements to the easement land. In fact, we have records going back 5 years of the city specifically requesting access to that area for various projects. What's the next step? Well, if they don't comply with the notice by Friday, we'll have to start legal proceedings. The city attorney is already preparing the paperwork. Friday came and went. The playground was still there. On Monday morning, the HOA board received a lawsuit from the city of Meadowbrook Heights. The suit demanded immediate removal of all improvements from the easement land, plus damages for the cost of delayed infrastructure projects, plus attorney fees. The total amount? Just over $7 million. I found out about the lawsuit because Karen called me that afternoon. But this time, she wasn't screaming. She was crying. They're going to take our homes. Everyone in the development is going to be liable for this. We can't possibly pay $7 million. I felt a little sorry for her, but not much. Karen, this didn't have to happen. If the HOA had worked with the city instead of fighting them, this could have been resolved without anyone getting hurt. But I didn't know. I thought we owned that land. Did you ever actually check the property records? Did you ever have the development surveyed? Long pause. I assumed the previous board had done all that. Well, assumptions can be expensive. The next morning, I was drinking my coffee on the front porch when I saw several cars pull up to the community center. They looked like official vehicles, and I could see people in suits getting out with briefcases and document folders. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was Steve from the HOA board. There's an emergency board meeting this afternoon. We need to discuss the lawsuit and figure out what our options are. What kind of options? Well, we've talked to a lawyer, and he says we basically have 3 choices. Fight the lawsuit and probably lose everything. Try to negotiate a settlement, or remove all the HOA board members and start over with new leadership. I could guess which option Karen preferred. And what does Karen think about those options? She's not taking it well. She keeps saying this is all a misunderstanding and that the city is overreacting. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. I decided to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because I figured I might need to defend myself against whatever accusations Karen decided to throw around. The community center was packed. Word had gotten out about the lawsuit, and everyone in the development wanted to know what was going on. Karen was sitting at the front table with the other board members, but she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Steve called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. Everyone here has probably heard about the lawsuit by now. We're here to discuss our options and decide how to move forward. He outlined the 3 choices their lawyer had given them: fight, settle, or restructure. But before he could go into details, Karen stood up. This is all completely unnecessary. We just need to explain to the city that we've been maintaining that land as a public service. Once they understand that we've been helping them, they'll withdraw the lawsuit. A collective groan went up from the audience. Even after everything that had happened, Karen still didn't understand the situation. Steve tried to be diplomatic. Karen, our lawyer has reviewed the case, and he doesn't think we have much chance of winning if we fight it. The city has clear legal authority over the easement land. Then we need a better lawyer. That's when Mrs. Chun, one of the residents, stood up. Karen, with all due respect, this mess is your fault. You've been running this HOA like your personal kingdom, and now you're going to cost all of us our homes. Karen's face went red. How dare you? I've been protecting this community's property values for 3 years. By calling the police on 10-year-old children? By harassing residents with frivolous violations? By illegally occupying city property? More residents started speaking up, and it quickly became clear that Karen had lost whatever support she might have had. People were angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame. Steve banged his gavel. We need to focus on solutions, not blame. Our lawyer says the best option is probably to negotiate a settlement with the city. What kind of settlement? Someone called out. Well, we'd have to remove all the improvements from the easement land, which would cost about $200,000. We'd also have to pay damages for the delayed infrastructure project, which could be anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million, depending on how the negotiations go. And if we can't pay, then the city would place liens on all the properties in the development. Every homeowner would be responsible for their share of the costs. Karen stood up again. This is ridiculous. We're not paying anything. This is the city's fault for not clearly marking their property boundaries. Steve looked at her with a mixture of pity and frustration. Karen, the property boundaries are clearly marked on the original development plans. They're also marked on the city's survey maps. We just never bothered to check them. Well, I think we need new leadership on this board. People who will actually fight for the residents instead of just rolling over for the city. That's when Mrs. Chun made the motion that everyone had been waiting for. I move that we remove Karen Pemberton from the HOA board for gross negligence and mismanagement. The motion was seconded immediately. Steve called for a vote, and the result was overwhelming. 43 in favor, 2 against, with Karen abstaining. Karen sat there for a moment, staring at the raised hands around the room. Her face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, something that might have been recognition. This is impossible, she said quietly. I've done everything for this community. I've protected your property values. I've enforced the rules. I've maintained our standards. Mrs. Chun stood up again. Karen, you called the police on a 10-year-old boy for riding his bike on a public sidewalk. You've been harassing residents with frivolous violations. And now you've cost us $7 million because you were too arrogant to check whether we actually own the land you were so determined to protect. Karen's hands were shaking as she gathered her papers. You'll be sorry. Without proper leadership, this community will fall apart. Your property values will plummet. This place will turn into a slum. But nobody was listening anymore. The vote had been taken, and Karen Pemberton was no longer the HOA president of Meadowbrook Heights. She walked out of the community center in complete silence, her head held high, but her face pale as paper. Through the window, I could see her sitting in her white SUV for several minutes, just staring at the steering wheel. When she finally drove away, I knew that her reign of suburban terror was finally over.